Even in the midst of this strife, there are some lessons that military experts and we can already draw from the Ukrainian battlefield. So we've gathered footage from Ukrainian and Russian sources that reveals that story.
This is the most profound transformation of warfare for 150 years, and it's a competition, and the competition has started.
Stalin called artillery the god of war, and his heirs hoped to crush their enemies with it. These heavy guns can hurl a 60-kilo shell more than 40 kilometers. Both sides are using long-range multiple rocket launchers too. Artillery was the big killer during both world wars, and so it is proving today. Ukraine started the war with more than 1,300 artillery pieces and rocket launchers. It's the use of so much artillery that largely accounts for the very high death rates in this conflict, cutting down people and levelling homes.
Artillery is very central to Russian military thinking, and particularly the Russian ground forces. They have always made very good use of artillery, and we look back to Chechnya, Georgia, Syria. All of these operations have been characterized by heavy reliance, Russian forces, on artillery.
Artillery has caused by far the largest number of casualties, and if you look at the number of Russian fatalities, thought to be around 15,000, you would realistically estimate that 2 or 3 times that number have received life-changing injuries. By far, the majority of those casualties have been caused by artillery. And if you look at the destruction of cities like Mariupol, that is the wholesale destruction of the built environment by artillery. So it is the dominant weapon of this war, and indeed any war that follows this kind of pattern.
Artillery can produce rippling barrages that plaster the landscape here in eastern Ukraine in much the same fashion it did during World War II, without much accuracy. What's new in Ukraine is a widespread use of laser-guided shells to pick off individual targets. Here, Ukrainian artillery knocks out 4 tanks, one after the other. Unlike the infantry soldier with his Javelin missile launcher, the guns knocking out these vehicles might be 20 kilometers away. This strike was by Russian artillery, a 152mm shell knocking out a Ukrainian tank.
Well, there's a few developments in artillery, as you know, since the Second World War. Obviously, the kinds of shells that are used, but perhaps the most profound development has been the networking of artillery systems into a modern and quite complex battlefield command system that not just allows the management of fire missions and the prioritisation of them, but allows the tracking of artillery shells so the logistics of artillery can keep up with the pace of modern war.
Those images hint at another significant development, the importance of drones, both in finding targets for artillery and in many other ways. When hunting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, American intelligence officers coined a term for the persistent surveillance of people and places. They called it the unblinking eye. In Ukraine, the unblinking eye exposes anything moving to attack or being countered by manoeuvre. Both sides are using drones in large numbers. It means it's becoming harder and harder to find a hiding place on the battlefield.
What we're seeing now in this transparent battle space is a constant flow of data, whether it's from space or from social media, which gives you clues and cues as to where to look, whether you're looking for a formation or an individual. Some of those lessons have been learned in Iraq and Afghanistan and are now being applied at scale.
The logo here is that of Aerorazvedka, a volunteer collective of Ukrainian tech nerds who've built their own drones and armed them, dropping munitions onto Russian targets. Finding a target and then hitting it is an example of fusion. Linking drones, electronic intercepts, all kinds of intelligence to strike weapons, as we see the Ukrainians doing here, shows that they've been more successful than the Russians in adopting fusion, as practiced in the American War on Terror, to hit all kinds of targets, but including generals.
The Ukrainians have done what appears to be a really good job of taking the intelligence feeds that they've got, fusing them, and then really thinking about how they target tactically, but also at the operational level. Taking out the Moskva, taking out a series of high-level Russian field commanders are victories of intelligence. Intelligence and the clever use of it, I think the Ukrainians have done very well at. The Russians not so.
Air superiority has been defined as central to military success for decades, but the Russians haven't achieved it, leaving onlookers wondering whether that's their incompetence or something deeper is changing. Ukraine has used Soviet-era air defense missiles and combined them with thousands of shoulder-launched ones sent in by NATO countries. The result is that the Russians have lost dozens of aircraft and been unable to gain air superiority. For Western air forces used to operating in uncontested skies over Iraq or Afghanistan, it's a reminder that effective air defense can swing a campaign and threatens the future of the pilot.
There's no doubt in my mind that there's a trend towards unmanned and autonomous systems. There has to be, as defences get more lethal, as you seek to achieve decisive mass without committing millions of people, then the use of unmanned, the use of more autonomous systems, I think, is inevitable. But the fact that Russia is relying on cruise missiles to do things at range is to a large extent driven by the fact that its air force has been pretty well neutered by the Ukrainian both ground and air forces.
So what the Russians have done is rely on missiles like the Iskander to hit targets deep in Ukraine, rather than risk pilots and highly expensive fighter jets. They've used the unmanned solution. Air and sea-launched cruise missiles have been employed as well in order to hit targets in western Ukraine in places like Lviv. Indeed, the Russians now rarely use crewed aircraft beyond their own front lines and stay very low when they do so.
I think it's clever to use long-range missiles for, strategic and operational strike missions if you don't have to put a valuable fighter with its crew at risk when you can use a missile. I think that is the clever employment of air power. Indeed, I think that is where most Western air forces need to go. They need to have more unmanned systems and more unmanned strike missiles, whether they're air or ground launched.
It's not just piloted aircraft that are under threat from a combination of an unblinking eye of surveillance and a variety of missiles and other defences. In Ukraine, once again, we're hearing questions about whether we're witnessing the death of the tank. We've seen so many armoured columns turned into scrap metal that many have concluded that advancing with people inside these vehicles is becoming suicidally difficult. By providing thousands of lightweight anti-tank weapons like the NLAW, Western countries have compounded Russian difficulties. But people walking across the battlefield are very vulnerable. These Ukrainians are setting up a shot with a Javelin missile. Watch the man on the right. He's constantly looking around for drones or other signs of the enemy. Without the protection of an armoured vehicle, they need bravery and luck.
The reality of the war in Ukraine is that it's dominated by shot and shell, whether it's fired from the air or from the ground. And the only way you can move in that environment is through the protection of an armoured vehicle. And the only way you can move across difficult country is to have either a tracked armoured vehicle or a very big wheeled armoured vehicle. So armoured vehicles have not gone out of fashion in any way. What is changing is the way that the protection is done, because there are new materials and new ways of providing protection to an armoured vehicle which should make them lighter and more secure.
In the open lands of eastern Ukraine, though, it's just too easy to follow tracks and find the vehicles, armoured or otherwise, with the inevitable artillery strikes to follow. If it proves as hard for the Ukrainians to take ground as it has for the Russians, then those trench lines will continue to solidify, and what we'll be witnessing is the emergence of a First World War-style stalemate. So across much of eastern Ukraine, survival requires being dug in, and the trenches have been under bombardment for weeks. In some places, it's beginning to look like a moonscape. The age-old pendulum that swung between attacker and defender in warfare now favours the latter. In many places, there's been no real movement for weeks, and it may be that the side that runs out of precision weapons first will be the one that loses.
We don't know how long this conflict could run on for. And we also haven't yet really seen the full impact, I think, of sanctions in Russia and what that is going to do to their defence industrial base, for example, and their capability to manufacture some of these critical capabilities.
For many militaries, watching this level of destruction now being visited on Ukraine prompts much reflection on the inadequacy of their own defences and the cost of putting that right versus the price of getting it wrong and becoming involved in war on this scale.
How much is it going to cost to rebuild Ukraine? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take to eject Russia from Ukraine? How many people have died? I would say the cost of having a properly configured military capability, national security capability, that makes serious opponents think twice, maybe 3 times, about whether they want to take you on. That's got to be cheaper in the long term than letting it happen and then trying to remediate, to rebuild.
The debate among professionals is just beginning, but what's already clear is that the return of warfare this destructive between big European countries has reminded us of the terrible costs of large-scale operations and the price of paying for an effective defence.